So say you have a long-lived quantum computer that is attached to 3D printers, massive 3D printers on the far side of the moon, okay? And say you have an astronomer in the 22nd century who detects a comet aimed at Earth, and it's going to hit in like a month. There's not enough time to build a rocket to go and destroy that comet. But he can send a command to the quantum computer 20 years in the past to print out a rocket to go and intercept that comet at the coordinates at which he's detected it. And that would enable you to destroy that comet. I mean, that's the kind of scenario that we're talking about with, I think, what is sort of the transitional technology that will lead ultimately to actual time travel. It's this sort of informational time travel where you're using a quantum computer to send information into the past that enables you to better meet a challenge in your future. You see, the way I put it in the new book is planting seeds in the past for a better tomorrow.
Greetings, future fossils. Welcome to episode 171 of the podcast that explores our place in time. And wow, is this week's episode perfectly that. I really can't think of anyone better than Eric Wargo to talk with about the consequences of a paradigm shift in our understanding of time. Specifically, what happens when we break through the taboo that time flows in one direction and start seriously entertaining the possibility that we are informed, influenced in some way by the future, or that all moments occur simultaneously and the subjective passage of time is a kind of Doppler-like artifact of our relationship to information. In episode 117, we went into deep detail about the science in his first book, Time Loops, his second book, Precognitive Dreamwork, and The Long Self, anchors this conversation in something much more personal and widely accessible, namely teaching people how to identify tracers of their own precognitive faculties in the records of their dreams. So, as a first for the Future Fossils Book Club, I invited Eric to join us for a discussion about his work. And so what follows is an unusual Future Fossils episode, although one I think I might try to reproduce in the future. One in which Patreon supporters join me for a live call with the author of a book I feel merits deeper discussion. Incidentally, the audio in this episode is a little squiggly, not as great as I would like, but it's a Zoom call. What are you going to do? I think the content more than makes up for it. Speaking of which, now is a great time to thank everybody that's joined on with the Future Fossils Patreon recently. Those of you who have listened to the show for a while know that there is no way I could make time for the extensive research and production I invest in every single episode without listener support. And as much as I may frame this show as an offering to the unborn archaeologists I imagine will one day dig up the data diamond on the moon, the longer I engage in the yoga of all of the invisible work that goes into making this the most quality program I possibly can for you, the more I realize it really is for you, my living audience, and the people in your lives for whom your listening to these conversations shifts things, subtly or not so subtly, in their conversations with you, and so on. An expanding wave of cultural processing of those deep questions that haunt our transitional age. So, special thanks to new patrons this week: Elizabeth von der Ahe, Brandon Carlson, Chad Eveslage, Maria-Antonia Miselli, Renee DePaula Jr., Alex Hote, and Agata Adolchik. Thank you, and thanks to the other people that continue to support this show through the rather turbulent churn I experience, as it seems most of the people who appreciate the show are, like myself, living out on the edge, where there is often more passion for deep discussion than there is financial recompense. And just a heads up that the ongoing bi-weekly patrons-only exclusive Future Fossils series continues with original essays, mailbag episodes, etc. So hop on, dear listener, and help me keep the weird alive. And with that, here is Eric Wargo back on the show for a delightfully palindromic episode, which is a fun little inversion of his first appearance, 171 and 117. I didn't realize that until I was recording this intro. Make of it what you will. Talking about the epistemic shift it's going to take for us to become a time-faring species. I promise that if you actually give this your full attention, it will change the way you think about things, and then we will want to hear you reflect on all of that in the Future Fossils Discord, which you can find in the show notes, along with all of the books we discuss and plenty of other good stuff. Thank you for listening. Thanks everybody who has been rating and reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts. It is hugely helpful. And thanks everybody for doing the good work of keeping the edge of the known and knowable peopled with brave, intelligent, and creative folks such as yourself. Enjoy and be well. Eric, thanks so much for joining. This is the first time we've had the author on for a book club conversation. I think that it's going to go really well.
Awesome. Glad to be here.
So today we are discussing this book, Precognitive Dreamwork and the Long Self, which prominently features a very mysterious object that I suspect was kind of planted, but we can get into that later. I think we might have brought that up the first time we spoke, but anyway, I would like to just start by having you explain a little bit about the difference between this book and time loops and why this one. Yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah, well, this book was actually not planned, and it's certainly wasn't part of my original trajectory. I mean, I really actually had a trilogy or quadrilogy of books that I wanted to write, and Time Loops was the first one, and the next one was going to be the book on precognition and creativity that I'm still slowly trying to work on. But after Time Loops came out, I mean, Time Loops is a kind of heavy read. And I think, unfortunately, I lose a lot of readers in the first quarter or first half of the book because it's pretty tense. And it doesn't really get to the interesting stuff, the stuff that I find most interesting until like the second half of the book. So yeah, I sort of bit off probably more than I should have tried to chew in a single volume. But anyway, after the book came out, I started being inundated with emails from readers sharing their dream stories. I mean, there wasn't a lot, dreams crop up again and again in Time Loops, and there's a chapter sort of devoted to them, but it wasn't sort of the main topic. And well, I quickly realized, and people at presentations, I would give a lecture and people would come up to me afterwards sharing their dream stories. And I realized, okay, there's a need for an accessible book on precognitive dreams. And it's actually, a lot of books have been written about precognition and premonitions, and even some books on precognitive dreaming, but none are really very good, frankly, and they're not informed by a coherent theory of precognition. And I realized, well, there's a need here, and a market for a book on precognition and on precognitive dreaming. And honestly, I was excited to write it because one of the things I'd kind of left out of Time Loops was my own experiences. I wanted Time Loops to be totally, full of evidence that scientists, skeptics would take seriously. And when you start talking about your own anecdotal experiences, that just immediately turns off, a big segment of the people I'm trying to reach and, if not convince, open their minds with the arguments I'm making. So I left all that stuff out of time loops for the most part, except for one experience in the epilogue or whatever. But anyway, so this was an opportunity for me to kind of tell my own story about my progress from skepticism toward acceptance of the reality of precognition and realization that, hey, I've always had these experiences. I've swept them under the rug or reinterpreted them in other ways or just ignored them. And I think that's true of many, many people. And I was discovering that it was true of some of my readers who were going, holy crap, I've been having these experiences, and yet I've been interpreting them in light of, the big one is Carl Jung, synchronicity. It's like, I just kind of like, okay, that's synchronistic. The universe is kind of giving me the thumbs up or something like that. But that's not a very useful, helpful theory ultimately. So it was very validating to get all these experiences that were a lot like mine, people who were on the brink of understanding or accepting the reality of time loops, but it hadn't been quite articulated for them. And so I think my first book did that for a lot of readers. But again, it was a challenging book that tackles a lot of topics and goes deep into the theory and the mechanistic hypotheses about how it might work and so forth like that. And I realized, well, there's a need for a book that's shorter, more personal, and more focused on dreams and dream interpretation. And unfortunately, that was a topic that I've always been interested in. I mean, for decades, I've been, I've read books on dreams, dream interpretation. Some of my professors in grad school were psychoanalysts. And so I was sort of steeped in that for a long time. So that's the origin of the new book. And it kind of derailed my larger project for about a year while I was working on it. Couldn't work on the other things that are sort of more gripping to me. So that's the origins of it.
Or that's the conventional narrative expedience origin of it, right? Because that's the, like Terence McKenna says, it's like storytellers, we have to give the story a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yes.
Right. But like to
yes,
your,
of course.
your whole point
yes, of
is,
course. And I'm totally open to the idea that any day some revelation might come to me, or some interaction with you or with someone that will go, oh my God, this is what caused me to write that book 3 years earlier. And these kinds of experiences, these sort of mega time looping experiences, are the kinds of things that readers have shared with me, and that there's a couple of them in the new book that are really mind-blowing, I think. I'm realizing that there's one story in the book about a friend and sort of colleague of mine, Toby, who was essentially having precognitive dreams related to my book Time Loops 30 years beforehand. But it's prompted a very deep reassessment of both of our biographies. I mean, for her biography is now a rabbit hole of precognitive connections and so forth, which she is constantly mapping out and exploring via active imagination and dream work and so on. And the same, I, in my own way, I'm doing the same kind of reassessment of my own biography and realizing that not only, her sort of discovery about this retrocaused my interest in this topic and sort of set me on a certain path. And these are the kinds of discoveries that lie in wait for anyone who embarks on this path of precognitive dream work. And that's sort of, I encompass it with the sort of rubric of the long self. We are really these four-dimensional space-time worms, essentially, worms in the best sense, snaking through the glass block of Minkowski space-time. Even if we think of our consciousness as sort of this little narrow cursor scrolling across that timeline, in fact, the evidence, I think, suggests that we are really thinking with our whole life. It's focused on the now, the present moment, but there are all kinds of experiences which really broaden that cursor, that window, and lots of experiences like dreams that are really wormholes connecting two different points in our life. I hope that answered whatever question you asked a few minutes ago.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, a couple things stick out in there that lead us into something I wanted to open up for discussion here, which is that, you talking about in writing the first book, it being a matter of trying to convince people and therefore leaving out the more personal narrative. But you make a point in that book, as well as this one, that one of the key features is that you had to be there piece of it, which is that whatever information we're getting about the future, our brains are only interpreting in light of the pieces that we have available to us. You know, you think about evolutionary function and how every adaptation is what Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba called an exaptation.
Exaptation, yeah.
Yeah, which is, you know, the appropriation of something that exists for a new function. And so there's this sense in which we are only capable of interpreting our precognitive content in light of, and you give all sorts of great examples, like Vladimir Nabokov seeing the future of the sale of Lolita to Kubrick and interpreting it in terms of like his childhood in Russia and like circus people instead of like Hollywood. And then also, not to totally spoil the party, but this makes a whole lot of sense in terms of the semiotic slippiness of the UFO phenomenon and the fact that we keep interpreting the UFO phenomenon through whatever sort of dominant metaphor possesses a given age. You know, that it's this particular technological metaphor, which if Stuart Davis were on the call, you know, Stuart, I love his insistence that we're missing the point by focusing on the craft with the UFO phenomenon, and that we should be asking about the intention and the beings rather than just like the details of the technology. You know, it's a presentist projection of our own weird preoccupation with gear. But yeah, this point about Hebbian learning is really interesting, and I'd love to pick your brain about this and then invite other people again at any point. Oh, good. Yeah, tell Stuart to get in here right now. He's got the Zoom link already. But I don't know if we talked about this the last time we spoke, but I remember Adi Livnat of Haifa University in Israel has a paper called Simplification. Let's see here. I'll pull it up and share it in the notes here. Simplification, Innateness, and the Absorption of Meaning from Context, How Novelty Arises from Gradual Network Evolution. He's talking about the way that he can kind of restore some of the thinking around Lamarckian evolution as gene regulatory networks are expressed in complex ways because of the interaction between the organism and its environment, that genes that are expressed together end up being more likely to fuse into a single gene. And he compared to the way
learning.
that Hebbian learning and the way that neurons that fire together end up, you know, fusing into these networks. And so he's saying this is, you know, there's something more than just an epigenetic angle to the idea that behavior can be encoded in the genome. And that touches on one of the things that I'd like to do with this call is kind of stretch beyond just the purely biographical dimension of this and into some of the other stuff that you've written about the role of this kind of time-binding phenomenon in what we would think of as more, you know, sort of primitive or simpler biological systems or just physical systems. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, what you're describing right now, you know, and this is honestly, this is pure speculation, but it's the kind of speculation that just feels right. And then I think, you know, that I just feel like something like this is going to turn out to be true. And it's that DNA, like so many other molecular systems in our biology, is going to turn out to be a quantum computer, or it's going to turn out to have quantum computing properties. And if that's the case, you know, the exciting dimension of quantum computing that I talk about in my books is that you can theoretically, with a quantum computer, send information back in time or have an input that follows an output. So the idea, and I speculate about this a little bit in the paper that I sent you by email, it's not published yet, you know, could DNA be essentially a computer system that is being programmed by future outcomes, which would be a kind of, you know, spin on Lamarck and a different way of thinking about epigenetics, or a different way of thinking about sort of Lamarckian evolution that's not epigenetic, that's genetic, utilizing a genetic DNA quantum computer. And again, I have no actual evidence for this, but it feels right. And so I'm gonna keep looking. I'm gonna keep reading the literature for hints that this is possibly the case. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Oh, well, first of all, hi, Stuart. Thanks for joining. And
Hey, Stuart.
yeah, great. And then also, yeah, we're to that point. This gets to the question that I keep chewing on when I'm considering your work, which is about the subjective notion of an arrow of time. You know, like in Liv Knott's model of this sort of genetic learning, it's still the case that even at the genetic level, these molecules are basically seeking a maximal entropy production or the, local entropy reduction, which, in like a Carl Friston free energy principle is about, uncertainty reduction. And so there's this thing I've been chewing on that has to do with, okay, well, if there is a Minkowski block universe model, why is it that we persist in experiencing it as going in one way?
Well, I have a couple answers to that. I mean, one is that we just don't know it. I mean, we're not going to solve this problem. Where we right now in the 21st century are not going to solve this problem. And this goes along with the whole question of consciousness. As you probably know, I'm not interested in the whole question of consciousness and what is consciousness and how are we going to explain consciousness. First of all, the term is so ill-defined. Everyone means something different by it. There's so many assumptions flying around. And then to think with our present scientific tools, we're able to somehow explain it at this point in our understanding of the brain, for instance, which is no. I mean, we know so little about the brain, honestly, at this point. That if it is a brain-based phenomenon, then we're not ready to explain it. But then if it isn't, then we still don't know enough about the brain to eliminate that possibility that it's not a brain-based phenomenon. So there's no hope of answering these questions. So it feels like game playing to me when philosophers discuss this and neuroscientists discuss this and people give TED Talks about it. I mean, I'm so sick of the question, honestly. As I've said in my books, what I do like about the search for consciousness in the brain is that serendipitously it's producing evidence for exactly what I'm interested in, which is precognition. And I think that microtubules are probably the answer, but not because they're the substrate of consciousness somehow. I forget what I was starting to say though, and I forget. Can you remind me of your question?
Yeah, that I would think of like almost like a Doppler shift type of thing, or like a polarization, which Philip K. Dick talks about also in his work. The idea that even if that all of these moments are simultaneous, there's still a gradient, a past to future gradient.
Right. I remember what I was going to say. Clearly, we are not in a position to know why our consciousness is focused on a single moment. But it's not entirely focused on a single moment. I mean, experiences like dreams, experiences like precognitive visions, hallucinations, so on and so forth, suggest that actually multiple moments in our timeline can be superimposed. And that's important. Two, even if there's a block universe and so on, that doesn't mean that there is not some sort of asymmetry that is causing us to experience time as going in one direction, even if it's not really. So there are all kinds of reasons why potentially we could experience things going one way. I mean, if, as is true, context is needed to interpret an experience or a memory, goes back to the question of source monitoring, which I keep coming back to in my books because it's so important and I think people are missing it. But source monitoring is crucial. The ability to source monitor our memories exceeds our ability to source monitor our premeries, our memories of things future. And that right there could be an explanation for why at any given moment in our block universe timeline, we experience ourselves as having a past that we know about and that we're moving towards a future that we don't know about. So we would always experience things that way if there's that imbalance in the ability to source and monitor information for our future. So I think I keep coming back to that. At least for now, I think that's a good placeholder explanation for why we experience time flowing in one direction.
I mean, not to place too much credit for this film's depiction of physics, but, like Tenet seemed like, I don't know, did you see that one?
I wrote about it, but I didn't see it.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I criticized the film based on its trailers, and then I still haven't gotten around to see it. I have a new baby, and it's like trying to watch a movie is impossible. So, yes. you know about that.
Oh, certainly. But the notion that basically they're their version of time travel in the film is the local reversal of like the entropy function of a character. So they still have this experience of like their own. That kind of links to some of the other stuff that you sent me that you're working on regarding time travel and the way that even time travelers due to what's the guy's name? Nabokov, the Russian.
Igor.
I marked that page.
Yeah, Novikov. Yes.
Yeah, the self-consistent universe that all time-like curves are closed, and so there's no there's no possibility of a time travel grandfather paradox type situation, because whatever you do in the past just sort of closes the causal loop that results in you going back through time.
Yeah. The easier way to think about that is you can influence the past. And according to the time loops theory, we're always influencing the past. That's what a time loop is, a closed time-like curve. You cannot change the past from what it was, which is an incoherent statement anyway. You will always find, the time traveler will always find that whatever they did in the past was already part of their backstory. Okay. And this eliminates grandfather paradoxes if you think about it, because we habitually, because of science fiction stories, we habitually think about this kind of narrative in which a time traveler suddenly decides to change the past, or suddenly decides to change history and steps into a time machine. But there's no timeline in which that would be the case. You see, I mean, there's no timeline in which a time traveler would have the idea of changing the past, because if they did, it wouldn't exist. So the only timelines where there are time travelers who are going into visiting their own histories, which is a very limited portion of past time anyway. But the only time travelers who are going to revisit their own histories are those who were already visited by their future selves and are acting consistently within that narrative. So this is another book that I'm working on. I sent you a sort of condensed version of it. A lot of the barriers, honestly, to time travel, I believe, are conceptual barriers that we've inherited from science fiction. Oddly enough, the science fiction writers tend to be not very good at thinking about this stuff. And it's actually the same is true of physicists. The best physicist, Stephen Hawking, in a sort of, I think it was a Guardian article sort of talking about time travel and how fun it is to think about, but it's really impossible because X, Y, and Z. And his reasons are all the same errors that everyone commits when thinking about time travel. It's very hard to think about retrocausation, time travel in any form. And Stephen Hawking, the great mind, commits the same fallacies that most people do, and that a lot of science fiction writers have done. Same is true of Michio Kaku. I mean, in one of his books, I mean, he lists a lot of paradoxes that are supposedly caused by time travel that are in fact not paradoxes. They're tautologies. Tautology is different from paradox, and tautology rules a time travel universe. And that's all we mean by a time loop.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Hey, what's up, Eric?
Hey.
Nice to have you. Thanks. I was listening to your podcast with Gordon White on Rune Soup around all this. And one thing that stuck out to me was he was pushing back on the block universe thing a bit. And he sort of landed on, well, I agree that free will is garbage, but there's still agency was something he brought out. So that there's some ground where we're at least experiencing agency, or maybe we're still, whatever little bubble we draw around this process to say is we have some influence, but we're not free from other prior causes. And that's something that comes up when we're talking about all this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, free will is the other big hang up that if we're going to actually move into a future where we're time faring, where we're time travelers, we have to stop getting hung up on this idea of free will, because it's a conceptual blockade. And that's not to say there isn't free will, but free will is part of the block universe. So I experience my freely willed action to, lift my water glass right now. All free will means to people who are really hung up on it, if you drill down, if you sort of, really get to the bottom of it, all free will means is that they don't like the idea that if you replayed the universe from the start, all the same initial conditions, you would make that same exact decision again. And that's what no free will means in a block universe, that in fact, history will always be the same. And somehow that feels like a limitation on our freedom. That somehow feels constraining. But the point is, we wouldn't have the mentality that this was different from something else, or not different from some other history. That our consciousness, our awareness is part of that same block universe. And incidentally, this is one possible reading of Nietzsche's famous eternal recurrence of the same. The idea that, and for him, it was a blissful realization. And for me, it's a blissful realization too, that if you replayed the universe, everything will happen exactly as it did before. So I think that I always ask people to kind of take that idea of free will and all the questions around free will and just set it over here on a shelf and look at the problem without worrying about that. Because, no one is saying that you aren't as free as you feel. I mean, we're all free, we're acting freely. But from a point of view, 5 seconds from now, my actions right now are set in stone. They're part of history and they're not alterable. And relativistic physics shows that for any given, freely willed act in the present, there is a point of view from which it's already in the past. So we have to accommodate our self-understanding and experience of uncertainty. Freedom really, really means uncertainty. I don't know what's going to happen in a moment. I don't know for sure what I'm going to do 1 second from now. That has to be included within the block universe. Our experience is part of the block universe. So I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
I just found it interesting that he preferred the term agency as a different way of thinking about what's going on from a magical perspective that he takes. Like what matters is that we can focus and create different.
I guess I don't know what he means exactly by agency. Does he mean sort of what I would think of as an intention? I mean, intention is a term that you find a lot in magical contexts.
Right.
There's the agency of Michael Levin at Tufts University, the biologist that's shaken up the academic world right now with his work on, he has a great piece at Aeon with Daniel Dennett, Cognition All the Way Down. Let me see, I'll pull this up for everybody, where they're talking about agency. And this, again, gets to this sort of bigger question about the evolutionary function of time loops that I like discussing with you, Eric, which is about directing the embryonic development or the regenerative development of an organism with bioelectric fields. And he is coming at a critique of Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenesis from a completely different angle, where he's saying we don't need morphogenetic fields to explain this because we can see that the bioelectric imprint of an organism is what's governing the decisions that cells are making. And that's sort of to the live not piece too, which is that, when we think about natural selection and random mutation, there's this notion that shows up in the conversation around evolution that there is this part is deterministic and this part's not. And when you dive down, when you fine grain the biological systems, you see that at every level they are, running downhill thermodynamically. Mm-hmm. And that is what forms the basis for the kind of like internal structuring that we could call intelligence, like trying to navigate what Richard Doyle calls the search algorithm for max entropy production. So like this seems to me to get to a core question: is randomness subjective or objective? And it seems like, based on what you're suggesting about self-consistent universe and the fundamental uncertainty that a time traveler must have in order to create their own history, that what we experience as free will is, like a perceptual artifact of the limits of our ability to resolve a system deterministically, but that's fundamentally irreducible in some way. That no one of us as agents can know the whole thing, that there are fundamental horizons on the macro and micro of what we're capable of modeling.
As you know, probably from the piece that I sent you, and I haven't published about this, but I don't believe in knowledge at all. I mean, I think that what we call knowledge is a pretense, to sort of creating a map to guide our actions. And I think historians and philosophers of science would agree with that. The trouble is that news has really not trickled into physics very far, but it really influences how we think about observation and so on in a physics experiment too. I mean, what is it to observe something? It's kind of implicitly to know something, but if we're not knowing, if we're just sort of interpreting various sensations within a certain cultural model or code, and then that's constantly shifting, then what is knowledge? I don't believe in knowing. And I think that it really makes it a lot easier to think about time travel and how a person could visit their own history, and their own history would be a whole landscape of things that they didn't know about their past. And incidentally, there's a wonderful story about this that I talk about in my new book by Ted Chiang, who is the author who wrote the story that Arrival is based on. He wrote this wonderful short story called The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate. And it's about time travel. And it's about a character who discovers that time travel is not changing the past or undoing something tragic that happened in the past, but it's gaining new knowledge that he didn't have before about that event, which is itself transformative and changes his life going forward from the point at which he time travels. And that's crucial, that distinction between changing the past, which is incoherent, and not both influencing, acting in the past, but also learning something new about the past that you didn't know before. That changes your life going forward. And this is going to be the impetus for time travel for our future time-faring descendants. It's not going to be changing history like some incoherent, Terminator scenario, where we're trying to assassinate some enemy or kill the baby Hitler or whatever. It's going to be learning something new, gaining new knowledge about the past, which makes for a better future in some way, and planting seeds in the past that will germinate into things going forward that will accelerate some process that we wouldn't have been able to embark upon as quickly otherwise. The example, and this is just it's just a sort of off the cuff example that I sometimes use. Imagine the initial technology for this will be quantum computers, I believe, because again, we can use them theoretically as communication devices between different times. So say you have a long-lived quantum computer that is attached to 3D printers, massive 3D printers on the far side of the moon, okay? And say you have an astronomer in the 22nd century who detects a comet aimed at Earth, and it's going to hit in like a month. There's not enough time to build a rocket to go and destroy that comet. But he can send a command to the quantum computer 20 years in the past to print out a rocket to go and intercept that comet at the coordinates at which he's detected it. And that would enable you to destroy that comet. I mean, that's the kind of scenario that we're talking about with, I think, what is sort of the transitional technology that will lead ultimately to actual time travel. It's this sort of informational time travel where you're using a quantum computer to send information into the past that enables you to better meet a challenge in your future. You see, the way I put it in the new book is planting seeds in the past for a better tomorrow.
You actually give a great example that I loved in this when you're talking like taking this stuff down out of the abstract philosophical and into the like retail product, which is the quantum the precognitive airbag in your car.
Exactly.
And I was like, yes, that's totally it.
Yeah. Well, right. The example in the book is my Tesla Model Q, which I bought in 2029 on a trip through a wormhole, has a precognitive airbag. It's a quantum computer controlled airbag, which deploys 1 second before an inevitable collision. And this is collisions that can't be foreseen by the artificial intelligence that drives the car. This is a separate process. And it deploys 1 second in advance of a collision and thus enhances that much more your chances for surviving that collision. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about, I think, with that's going to be the initial glimmers of precognitive technology will be things like that. Although, honestly, it's all going to be kind of skewed by the fact that people are going to use it to make money on the stock market, and that's going to throw things. That could be a singularity all its own when quantum computers are used to make buys on the stock market. So I don't know. Who knows what's going to happen? It's a murky future we're entering potentially. But that's that I think is coming. Something like that is coming.
So this is it feels like a good time to pass the ball and double down on the invitation for people to chime in on a point that I'd like to make about the relationship between the sort of irreducible uncertainty, the experience of the time traveler in their participation in a self-consistent time loop situation, and the archetype of the fool in the tarot. And like this notion that, a lot of the exopolitical lore, we just lost Stuart just in time for me to soft pass this, but there we go. So a lot of the exopolitical lore does have this dimension of both the idea that these beings are some sort of evolutionary descendant of humankind, as well as the fact that they are researching us, as well as the fact that they are strangely clueless. And like the fact that like that you would expect if they're our own like hyper evolved descendants that they would be not so damn foolish about, you know, like that you, oh, well, why would a ship ever crash, you know, if they're so smart? Yeah. So it seems as though, to plug into the conversation I had with Violet Luxton, like Sankofa, about looking back to look forward, you know, that term, that there's something kind of inherently an irreducible foolishness. And this gets to a point that you make about Freud, which is that he spends his entire life interpreting what I think you rightly identify as a precognitive dream as some sort of wish fulfillment thing. And yet you make the point that his fame in presenting a new theory of dreams that you believe is ultimately wrong, nonetheless vaults him to a fame that thus saves him and his family from the Holocaust.
Right.
You know, and so there's this like, it's related to this idea that when you ask people how they're going to vote in an election, they often give you the wrong, like they don't actually know themselves well enough to give you an answer, because in the days before the election, if it turns out that every one of their family members is going to vote the other way, they will vote the other way so as not to misalign themselves with the support system upon which their daily lives depend. And so there are like all of these ways that evolutionary pressures impinge on us such that being quote unquote wrong is actually better for you than being right. And, you know, I know that this kind of foolishness is absolutely inherent to my own praxis of precognition in my daily life, and me just sort of like following the impulse wherever it leads me, not knowing which cliff I'm about to walk off of. And I would love to just hear from people if there are personal life touch points for other people. I mean, obviously, like Todd, you're making some good points in the chat, and I would love, I mean, not to like put you on the spot, Todd, guess, but or Stuart or any of these people. I would love to hear from folks what, you know, if that resonates with your own experiences of premonition or of this sort of looped causality.
By the way, just to interject, I have not been watching the chat, and so apologies for, people should just chime in.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and Jay makes a point that SRI did a remote viewing experiment with the silver futures market. And, you know, made some good money on that. So, yeah. But of course, then you get into an evolutionary arms race where, you know, that's,
And this is another reason. I mean, that evolutionary arms race is, I think, an important probable answer to why precognition is just not our state of being, that we're not like constantly seeing the future and looking into the future, and that our consciousness is narrowed to a single window of time. You know, actually, what use would that be, really, especially in a universe where everybody has that kind of ability? I think evolution very quickly decided that you don't really want precognition in that sense. You want maybe a kind of a short range responsiveness slightly, but that it's probably overall most adaptive for learning to be primarily constrained by what's happened before. And I suspect that that's an important part of the answer. I'm glad you mentioned that. And what you're saying about being wrong, ending up being right, I mean, this is key. Honestly, I think this is sort of the key to what I call weird, the sort of ancient kind of Anglo-Saxon version of the fate.
Good weird.
Good weird. You're always wrong. You're always wrong. But your wrongness ultimately pays off slightly more, I think, than being right. And there's versions of this in a lot of philosophical systems. Hegel called it the cunning of reason. Jacques Lacan devoted a lot of ink to, saying how that it's the non-duped, the people who are right about their own selves and their egos who are actually the most likely to err in their life choices. And it goes to the idea that I've emphasized again and again, that the unconscious is smarter than we are, so we may feel like we're effing up in our lives, but I don't know if I can swear on this show, but
definitely.
Okay, well, that fuck up that you made that was so embarrassing back when you were 23 or whatever, that may in some oblique way contribute to your success, when you're 43, and it's that kind of logic that you start to see when you start looking at yourself four-dimensionally. So yeah, I love this idea of being wrong as a way of being right.
Well, I mean, it's also it's sort of in keeping with the Buddhist notion of skillful means. And, you're being drawn into a situation, like, oh, you think you know why you're doing this, but you really don't. And, I can speak to that in my own life. You get into a lot of the rhetoric in both non-dual philosophy and sort of more Western Christian Judaic theology is about, that you can't disobey, or that, like, when you feel like you are disobeying God, you're actually playing back into a situation where you realize, like the Buddha is asked by his wife after he returns awakened, did you really have to leave? And he's like, well, in retrospect, no, but yes, that's part of the evolutionary sort of circuit, is rejecting a good tip from the future that it turns out I was actually sort of playing into this whole learning process, where looking back on it, I can say, oh, like it seemed like I was saying no, but really I was, like to your earlier point, it sort of just defeats the whole purpose of trying to phrase this stuff in terms of the like inadequately simple free will determinism kind of concept. So Stuart, you've got a question you're asking in chat. Is there any parallel between the observer effect in quantum and an observer effect in precognition? Does viewing the future collapse a wave function of possibilities? Yes, occupied at the moment, yes. Does viewing the future collapse any kind of wave function of possibilities in the future? Guessing not in a block universe scenario, but what fun is any conversation about temporality without some non-physicist invoking an ill-fitted quantum analogy? Whee! Insert manic laughter.
Indeed. Yeah. Well, this is, and honestly, I'm an outlier here. I mean, most people who write about precognition will say exactly that's, or something like that outcomes in the future are open-ended. It's a big wave function and that we're somehow collapsing it or whatever. And the way Stuart phrased the question is kind of a quantum way of phrasing the same question that has always arisen around prophecy. Okay. Does prophesying a thing lock it into place or whatever? And the answer to this is complicated. First, I'll say I don't believe in wave functions. I think the retrocausal interpretation of quantum mechanics erases the wave function as anything other than an index of our uncertainty about how things are going to turn out. But the idea of the wave function as something real that is collapsed upon measurement goes away in a retrocausal framework, because there never was any wave function. That's simply a way of expressing probabilities and our uncertainty. But in fact, our measurement or any interaction is what is retro-determining the properties of that particle that you're measuring. So essentially, this is why there's no randomness either. I don't believe in randomness, and retrocausalists don't believe in randomness either, because it's in fact any interaction or measurement that is what we would describe as collapsing a wave function is in fact sending that information back in time. It's actually an expression of true retrocausation. The causation goes in both directions, and any measured outcome at any point in time is a product of causation going in two directions. Now, so the idea of, well, you predict, I don't know, let's take a hypothetical example, a plane crash maybe, and you have a dream that a plane is going to crash, and does that lock it in place? Well, it goes back to those same rules about the self-consistent universe that we talked about earlier, and the sort of incoherence of the idea of a time traveler, suddenly having the idea of changing their past somehow, and how that there's no backstory for that. Well, there's no backstory for a future that is averted by, say, a warning in a precognitive dream. Okay, that's not going to happen. And this is why precognitive dreams are so often ignored, okay, or misinterpreted. We seldom realize a dream is precognitive until the event has come to pass. And then, we feel guilty because, I should have known, I should have been able to warn someone. If you actually do the work of interpreting that dream, you may find that regret, that sense of self-doubt is included already in the dream. and this is a big theme of the new book, is these misunderstandings about time and time travel really are important to get a handle on, to understand how precognition really works in our lives. So I think that instead of, that the standard answer that you'll get in a typical ESP book is that we precognize possible outcomes, but they're not set in stone. Okay. My answer is that no, we precognize actual outcomes, but obliquely, in a way that we will never understand usually until the event comes to pass. And this, importantly, offers a new way of interpreting Freudian psychoanalysis. I mean, Freud offered all these reasons for why dreams distort our lives. And he believed that there was a censor in our heads that kept us from knowing, forbidden desires and forbidden things. Well, I think he was wrong about that. I think that there's not a censor. It's simply when information flows into the past in the brain of a freely willed agent, it's going to be oblique and distorted, because as freely willed creatures, as creatures with agency, we could act to prevent an outcome that we foresee clearly that we don't want to have happen. Even the clearest premonitions, for instance, of disaster. I'll give an example, like one of the best current modern cases of a precognitive dreamer who routinely dreams about disasters that come true is Elizabeth Crone. She's a woman in Houston. She's a mother and grandmother in Houston who, ever since being struck by lightning in the parking lot of her synagogue in 1988, her story is amazing. She has frequent dreams about disasters, especially air crashes or air disasters involving airplanes. And they come true, like within a day or a couple of days generally. And even in her case, she learned at a certain point to email herself these dreams. So she had a date and a timestamp on these dreams. For instance, her most famous case is that she precognized the miracle on the Hudson, when the plane landed in the water on the Hudson and everyone was, saved by the skillful piloting of Sully Sullenberger was the name of the pilot. Anyway, she had a dream about 6 hours before that and emailed herself this dream that plane, and she got it down to two airlines. She knew it was an American carrier, and it was either U.S. Airways or another, that it was landed on the water in New York, and all of the passengers were standing on the wings. That was the bizarre detail of it. 6 hours later, images go viral on the internet of passengers standing on the wings of this plane in the Hudson River, waiting to be rescued by boats. Even there, okay, that is so precise, but even there, okay, down to like one of two airlines. But when is it going to happen? Is it really going to happen? I mean, she has dreams that don't come true. Who are you going to call? There are so many factors that prevent premonitions from being acted upon in ways that, so when you start studying premonition from this point of view, you realize that, we're not getting precognition is not some kind of radar for events in the future that we could then avoid. It's something very different. And I think it's like that precognitive airbag. It's a preemptive working through process, a preemptive preparation process for upheavals. For the most part, those upheavals are very minor. They're not deaths and disaster and things like 9/11 or the Titanic or plane crashes. For the most part, they're, very, minor turning points in our days. But the point is, we are being sort of prepared for those events. I think that's when you start to realize how precognition works and what it really is, then these questions about, prophesying something and then it being unavoidable and all that, they kind of go away, because that's not the way prophecy works. That, only in stories, only in myths is that the way it works. And it's a lot more complicated and a lot more oblique and murky.
Jay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's quick. I hope. Earlier, it came up in the conversation I was mentioning in the chat, the SRI remote viewing experiments, which I remember you talked about, Eric, in time loops. And it got me thinking about how, Ingo Swann, the famous remote viewer, they did these experiments, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, where they found in locked Faraday cages, right, where in these safes inside Faraday cages, where Ingo Swann was to be remote viewing some kind of like tableau, some kind of like some objects in that safe, they found like extra light that shouldn't have been there, right? When he was supposed to be remote viewing that environment, which kind of had like a lot of implications to it, right? And it got me thinking about how, there's these anomalous accounts of people kind of watching themselves in the past or watching a loved one in the past. And, it's been kind of thrown around a bit, like the idea of, could someone be haunted by their own future self? Or something like that, right? In this kind of like decentered way, where it's not just like, you within the brain, like passing notes to yourself, but could be kind of more within the wider grid of the environment or kind of baked into the fabric of reality rather than notes within the brain or something like that. And so forgive me, but do you have like, no pun intended, like a position on that kind of decenteredness?
Yeah, my position is, it's going to sound like reductive and kind of closed-minded, and it's not. But I think it's very important to push the most reductive version of the hypothesis that I'm proposing, because nobody else is. It feels like my role in life is to push this reductively so that someone finally will test it. Because until someone tests this and falsifies it, then there's no way of answer these questions, honestly. So I'm going to give you my position statement on this, is that though there's no extended, grid like you're talking about, that this is all in the brain. It's all in the mind. And you don't need that larger grid to explain these phenomena. Now, with an asterisk by it, because yes, there are certain reports here and there, certain findings here and there scattered around, which don't seem to fit. But it fits so much of the data so well that it makes me distrust all of those isolated data points. And I don't know what to make of the report you're talking about of the added light in the Faraday cage. I mean, this was actually measured objectively, or was this a subjective experience of Ingo Swann?
I mean, if we're to believe Puthoff and Targ's account and MindReach and other places, yeah. So.
It was objective, yeah.
Eric, you might be intentionally, accidentally wrong in order for the benefit of this idea.
I am so open to that idea, Michael. I mean, that's honestly, part of me hopes that I'm wrong about a lot of this stuff, because my hypothesis about this, and I will add to it the hypothesis, again, it's only a hypothesis, but that a lot of the data that is interpreted as remote viewing, as telepathy, as mediumship, a lot of this stuff fits very well within a misrecognized precognition framework. But that also yanks out from under us, a lot of existential hopes that come along with that extended mind, extended consciousness idea, such as survival of bodily death. Hey, I'd kind of like to survive bodily death. But I think it's important to push the reductive, it's a really important part of science. And like people who have a bee in their bonnet or whatever about materialism, think, well, let's stop being reductive. Well, no, you have to be reductive. I mean, for science, for knowledge to progress, you've got to be reductive. That's part of the dialectic, of scientific progress. And so I see it as my role to kind of push as reductively as possible this hypothesis and, see how far we can take it, because without doing that, I mean, it's an important possible falsification of these extended mind, extended consciousness theories. Theories need to be falsified in the sense of trying to throw as many challenges at them to see if they hold up. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do here. So yeah, my position, again, it's a tentative position, but it's a sort of a deliberately chosen position, is that this is all in the brain. But the brain, man, is so much cooler than people tend to think. I mean, I really think I describe the brain as a tesseract. I think the brain is a kind of time machine, literally. And if we start to understand that, it opens up mind-blowing possibilities for understanding a lot of things in our lives and in culture more generally.
I want to put a pin in that after Charlie gets his question in, because in the unpublished stuff that you sent me, there's a section on top-down causation and sort of longer orbits of time binding. And I really want to make sure that we get to that, because that kind of touches on everything we've talked about as far as teleology in a greater sense and UFOs and so on. But before, Charlie, thanks for being patient.
So I might be a little out of sync, shitty internet, but basically, Eric, I'm curious. I saw that you thanked Adam Ellenboss in the comments of Time Loops, and I'm wondering what the content of y'all's conversations was. And
he's a good friend. He's a good friend of mine, and yeah, I think we had some friendly butting of heads. For context, he's an astrologer, and but he's very interested in ancient astrology, and he's unlike most astrologers. He's very interested in divination and the idea of predicting the future with astrology. Apparently, I'm not at all aware of the astrology scene beyond what I know from talking to Adam, but apparently that's like sort of taboo even in astrology. I don't know why, but anyway, he's very interested in these questions of prediction and divination, and I will also say I've seen him at work, and he's phenomenal at divining things using astrological charts. And I have my own ideas about how it works that are quite at odds with probably how he would understand it. But yeah, as I was sort of writing the book, we had a lot of very fruitful conversations about these issues, about Jung, about archetypes, about things that we both, fundamentally disagree on, but I think we both recognize that we're just using different conceptual frameworks for possibly understanding the same thing, and it's a matter ultimately of choice about how you conceptualize these issues. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, Adam's awesome.
Before I ask the question I want to ask, does anybody else want to dip in here? If not, that's okay. So is it okay for me to read just a short 3-sentence passage from this piece, Eric?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Sure.
Another language to help think about such a top-down relationship is homeostasis. Each level is a kind of homeostatic control on the level below it. Life is a control system on entropic physical processes. Mind is in turn a control system on life, and culture acts as a control system on the individual mind. It is retrocausation that allows these emergent levels to causally transcend the lower ones and act back upon them, meaning we could also view cultural or biological evolution as at least partly a matter of future forms acting as a kind of control system on past ones. You relate this to the term syntropy and this broader notion that, again, I like the way that Terence McKenna put this. He says, physics asks us to accept one free miracle, or to grant one free miracle, which is the Big Bang, the inexplicable singularity at the beginning of time. And he's like, I would rather ask for one free miracle at the end of time, which is the Teilhardian omega point, right? And so, obviously these are the same thing if you're putting the entire universe on a single wave function or a single Mobius strip of self-knowledge. Or I don't know if you read, we talked about this when we had a book club on this book, but Greg Egan's novel Distress articulates this as a anthrocosmology, which is this unifying theory that a lot of people are afraid to actually see published and like send terrorists to try and prevent its publication because they're worried it will close the historical process that that will signify the bookend at the end of time. And it turns out not to be the case in that book, but that it's sort of this nested process of self-awareness and like retrospection on all these different levels. And so when I think about top-down causation, I'm thinking about it through the lens of complexity scientist Jessica Flack's work, which is on social hierarchies as a form of collective computation about the environment, and like status as being a way for a social group to minimize friction within the group in terms of like to optimize the entire group of organisms for collaboration. As individuals, we may not like it for the same reason that like an individual mutation may not be appreciated at the level of the organism, but at every level there's a self-consistent kind of sense making about it. And so when you talk about this I fully appreciate the reductionist effort to sort of dissuade people from bringing in stuff like reincarnation. But I think that there's a secular way to go about this that resembles Timothy Morton's hyperobjects, where he's arguing that from a position of Einsteinian relativity, which you also take in Precognitive Dreamwork, that you're already in somebody else's past. And so at the level of all of civilization, the hyperobject that is civilization, the now of civilization is is, to use Brian Eno's term, it's a long now and a big here, and so the future state of that system from our tiny perspective is the present state of that system from its own perspective. And so he's arguing that the future of climate change, for example, is acting on us in the present due to our embeddedness in this secular, materialistic, transcendental hyperobject. And yeah, I'm curious to hear your or anyone else's thoughts on that.
Well, the next sort of trajectory in my work that I had to put on hold for the dream book is thinking about culture as a tesseract. Okay, so the first book was about the mind, the brain as a tesseract, but I believe culture is also a tesseract, because if humans are transmitting information backward in time within their own lifespans, then cultural systems are doing the same thing via ultimately those human beings, those human experiencers. Now, the most obvious way this works is in creativity. Okay, artists precognizing events later in their lives, well, that itself becomes potentially a transmission vector of information from the future to the past. But I think really the place where this would be most relevant would be in an initiatory tradition, especially one that utilizes psychedelics, entheogens, or whatever, which are opening up, precognitive experiences routinely for participants, in which you would have a transmission of information, not simply from the initiator to the initiand, but vice versa, where the shaman initiating a pupil, is learning from that pupil's experience on ayahuasca or whatever. And likewise, his own experience has been being transmitted backwards in his life and to his initiator in the past, and so on. So theoretically, you could have a retrograde transmission of information across generations. But the same thing would happen with just parents and children. Any kind of unequal age relationship is potentially a vector of retrograde information transmission through history. Now, the challenge is finding examples of this that are not totally off the wall speculative, but I've got a few favorites, and I'll just share them with you, just understanding that I have no proof of this. But okay, there's a famous example of the Dogon. Marcel Griot visits the Dogon and discovers that they somehow know about that Sirius is a double star system. Okay, and this has prompted so much New Age speculation. But what if the Dogon learned about the double star system of Sirius from Marcel Griot? I mean, he was interested in astronomy. I mean, he was sharing this with the elders or whatever of this group. What if this little fact of this double star system of Sirius is something that they learned from Marcel Griot, and it was transmitted back through the generations within that their initiatory system? What if? The culture contact provides lots of potential examples of this. Like you have the Aztecs who dreamed of Cortez beforehand, and he was thought to be, I guess, Quetzalcoatl. You had Captain Cook, who was a personification of Lono in Hawaiian Islands. Are these cases where the other, the cultural other was, and this very traumatic encounter with another culture was transmitted back through the generations within the culture and shaping their mythology in the past? I'm just throwing, obviously I cannot even begin to prove such an idea, but these are the kinds of things we should start asking. Because if the model is correct, that on an individual level, well, then this is a natural extrapolation from it.
Yeah. So in a recent episode of Weird Studies, J.F. Martel and Phil Ford make a kind of rhyming point about the prophecy of the New Jerusalem, the shining city on the hill, everything is illuminated. This turns up again and again and again in these sort of eschatological religious narratives. And they're like, go to Times Square. Like we're here, this is what, like, this is it. Right. We're in the New Jerusalem now.
Well, can I share, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I share my favorite example of this that I just remembered? And it actually goes back to the question about Adam Ellenboss, because this is something that he shared with me. Adam wrote his first book about his ayahuasca experiences, and he went to South America on numerous occasions and is sort of an expert on this. But he shared with me a book when we were talking about this possibility. I think I was raising to him the idea of retrograde cultural transmission. And like, he thought, wow, you'd have to look at this book. He gets out this book, and I forget the title of the book. I have it around here somewhere, but it's paintings by a shaman. And a lot of these paintings show flying saucers and cities floating in the air. And supposedly in this book, and unfortunately, it's hard to tell whether this claim is accurate, but supposedly these images crop up in the art of these Indians, going back, decades or centuries. They're iconographic elements that are long-standing in this tradition, and so like the immediate thought is, well, wow, did these Indians learn about flying saucers? I mean, okay, the obvious archetypal explanation for this is like, okay, well, this is an archetype, or these Indians have been interacting with flying saucers, throughout their history. But the other possibility is, wait, did they learn about flying saucers from Terence McKenna or from all of the ayahuasca tourists going down to South America now and bringing this cultural meme with them? And has it been transmitted through this initiatory tradition into the past, to inform this iconographic tradition? Is the flying saucer something that was introduced to this culture by Terence McKenna in 1970 or whatever, and went back?
That's like the worst, most pernicious form of anthropological cultural pollution.
Exactly. And I hasten to add, it's like there's a sort of a danger there. There's always this, idea that, we can't, the other can't think of these things by themselves, and we're the ones who have to introduce it. And I would hasten to add that the same thing would go in reverse. That the same thing would happen reciprocally. That there ought to be aspects of our own culture that are equally shaped by our own encounters with the cultural other. So I don't want to,
Well,
I put that out there right there, but.
I don't know if you've written about this, but I would not surprise me that you have, given the frequency with which you quote Philip K. Dick. But the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, about a spacefaring billionaire who returns to infect everyone and like duplicate himself into them. It seems like it's basically Philip K. Dick talking about precognizing all of the spacefaring billionaires who have like gone back in time to infect him so that he writes this book.
Another fictional example of this idea is Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, because there the overlords, they look just like devils. And it turns out that, well, we've essentially, our race, or our civilization has been precognizing their arrival, all these centuries through this, sort of archetype of the devil or demon.
Todd, and then James.
Thanks, Michael. Gosh, yeah. So I've been listening this whole time and nodding my head a lot, shaking my head a lot, because I just so agree and recognize as well as disagree in so many things. But just real quick, I just got this yesterday, so I'm a little behind the lesson here. But I've been regularly experiencing really clear, interesting precognitive dreams all my life, and I really resonated with how you were describing how most people are with it. For me, it was, it's like, wow, this is crazy, and my continual reinterpretations, and then, but never really, as Michael knows, I've known Michael, I've got a lot of learning curves under my belt, and this is just one that I've been putting off for a long time. And so when this came across my radar recently, I got a little excited because I thought, I think I'll probably do well to dig into this one right now, because I'm still, living with those experiences and continually. So So anyway, all that said, I'm also I'm not an academic. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an author. I'm not really into the entheogens anymore since I was a teenager, but I'm really developing my own future fossils ethic in the arts, based on following this group and the themes. So all that said, my real interest and curiosity about all this, aside from my own personal life, is I'm very much an advocate of anybody who's into the nature of consciousness and the states and causality and just all these, various transpersonal fields of consciousness. I'm always very interested in how it applies in the fields where these types of states and stages are most regularly, vividly occurring, which I've found is in what's called the sacred arts of dying or end-of-life spirituality, which is really a broader umbrella for aging, grief, illness, suffering, caregiving, especially caregivers healing themselves, but becoming intimately familiar with those altered states that, a lot of times you work with people in comas, and some of my mentors and teachers, have methods of communication with people in coma and dementia type states that is just profound and world work. It really, and the reason why it's world work, and I get a lot of this from my long-term kind of association with Deepak Chopra's notion of a wizard living backwards in life. That's my life to a T, because I've found myself finding the most illuminative lens on the human experiences, looking kind of backwards through development and story from the end to the beginning. You want to understand childhood development? Go hang around with dying people and hear their stories and learn how to listen and inquire deeply, very deeply, and become skillful there. And now, now you're going to see the leverage points of how we avoid tyranny, how we avoid boys especially becoming, and so to bring back around though, so the role of any sort of experiments or work or just direct experience of the broad range of states and stages and meditative applications and psychological applications and dreaming, especially, because dreaming becomes more vivid than I think most people realize in the end of life work, because of our deepening backwards journey that we're forced to be taking, And there's a notion that in the art of dying work that the soul attended to responds 1,000-fold. And in my experience, that's no fucking exaggeration, and there's people who have avoided that, just cultural, social reasons, mostly for, all our lives, but then all of a sudden start finding some sort of effective practice, even dream journaling and talking about dreams will just start. And this work that you're doing, Eric, with the precognitive stuff, I think, man, it has really profound, it's a field, of practice. And that is, like the kid said, the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few, because everyone avoids it because you're asking them to look at the sun, right? But if you don't and you lean into it, because you can't just dive into it unless you're some sort of, weirdo like me, but at least lean into looking at the sun, and we're going to have more data points, more, it's going to become more vibrant and alive. And I think in that we will also, and then getting into the more exo future remote, because that's a whole nother conversation, I think, when it comes to this, but just in the narrower conversation, I'm just asking about the art of dying component and implications there. And I think that's about all I got for now. So,
Well, one of the ironies of studying precognition and precognitive dreamwork and what I call precognitive life work is that it's people imagine, this is about the future. I'm going to make it big on the stock market, or I'm going to develop some sort of superpower. I'm going to be able to, be the Superman navigating the future. No, it's all about the past. This is all about re-looking at your life, and it's all about your biography. Now, I compare it to archaeology or paleontology. In fact, I think I call it a paleontology in the book. It's really about paleontology of your life and having these mind-blowing experiences where you are excavating your past and discovering things about your past that totally would have slipped under your radar before and that change everything. about your understanding of yourself, your biography. So yeah, I mean, what you're saying is really, I think, resonant. I think, so I'm eager to, I hope you like the book, and let me know, reach out to me if you have thoughts, because what you're saying, I think, is really key.
Folks.
That does tend to come across like a fart in church. So I
Okay, well, thanks, Charlie. Thanks for joining us. So there's this other piece, hairpinning back. Thank you, Todd. I will let that one simmer. Again, like thinking back about like the nestedness of all of these things. If you're going to challenge free will and determinism as useless categories, and we're talking about selection pressure and or uncertainty operating at every level, and this notion of syntropy and telos, syntropy is that which is drawing things together into, a meta individual or something like, the advent of multicellularity, the advent of sociality, these major evolutionary transitions. If we're going to talk about childhood's end, if we're going to talk about the spiral and the mechanisms by which we can get sort of reverse cultural or retrograde cultural transmission, it's worth bringing up Jonathan Zapp's book, Crossing the Event Horizon, which is about the singularity archetype. And he's looking at this in a Jungian sense. He's proposing the singularity itself as a Jungian archetype. But if we see it as the sort of emergent archetype of a time loop, then that's yet another characteristic of the consistent reportage across all of these different UFO experiencers, that the beings they encounter are not individuals in this sort of simplistic modern way that we understand them, but are networked or mind linked in some way, and are therefore only the distal. Like a great example of this actually is the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still, where Keanu Reeves' character is the sort of just the tip of the tentacle of this alien intelligence that basically sleeves into a human body. And that, again, that's sort of consistent with the position of Vedanta about like avatarism and the notion that each of us is an emanation of a transcendental being. So I don't know. Again, that's just me sort of riffing on how it seems like your model accommodates for an even broader and more parsimonious embrace of all of these different pillars of various spiritual traditions in a way that makes them at least hypothetically open to some kind of empirical confirmation or exploration. Yeah, I just felt like getting that out.
Again, I mean, what I'm trying to offer is things that are testable, That's not to say that that's all there is. But yeah, I think that, I'm trying to sort of bring an idea into the world and let it be tested, and help and use it as a test of other rival ideas. As far as the UFO stuff, I'll say, although I keep coming back to it, the idea that UFOs are from our future or whatever, I'm not totally committed to that interpretation. I don't think any one interpretation, none of the interpretations totally fit. But I think to me, it's the kind of the most exciting and most counterintuitive, I think for most people, idea. And so I think it's important to kind of push it. But, like you're talking about how the behavior of reported aliens or occupants of these craft. Another detail which you'd mentioned earlier is that they crash so often, or at least during a certain period, they crashed so often. One of the interesting points that Jacques Vallée makes, and he makes it in his new book especially, and I had an opportunity to spend some time with him a couple of years ago, and he was constantly reminding me of this idea that, don't think that these things aren't necessarily disposable, that they're not disposable. I mean, there's something about many of these encounters which really seems like these objects and their occupants are expendable, disposable, and they're meant to crash, and I think it's an important perspective to keep in mind wherever they're sent from. And that certainly seems to be the case of the old crashes in the desert back in the 40s.
Space monkeys. You are not a unique snowflake.
Yeah.
Jay, you got your hand up. Nobody else does, so feel free.
Okay, I mean, unless anybody else has anything, but like along the lines of the the extraterrestrial hypothesis, we of course also have like the interdimensional or intradimensional hypothesis. Do you think that there's often the working possibility that people talk about some of these as being us from the future, that kind of time travel hypothesis, but also of course that like maybe they don't need FTL, faster than light drives, if they're coming from like just another universe. Do you think that there's a possibility that rather than like the block universe, that there could be blocks universes, like, or that there could be some kind of like technical advantage to being able to kind of like explore in an interdimensional framework that might have like two kind of space-time ecosystems running in parallel or something like that?
Well, this is, it's a cool idea. And I think there are so many people running around theorizing about that idea that I think it's my role to, again, be reductive and try to push the opposite. And so I'm not a fan of like multiverse. I'm not a fan of the many worlds interpretation in quantum physics, which is kind of like a quantum version of what you're arguing. Sure, are there multiple block universes? Yeah, why not? But how would we know? And I think it's important to try and push the explanation within a single universe, a single timeline, and see how that shakes out. So that I feel like is my role in all this. And so what you're suggesting maybe, and I think a lot of people, probably 90% of ufologists would like that idea. I mean, the idea that UFOs are from another dimension, whatever that exactly means, is very appealing. But I guess I'm most interested in pinning it down to, this timeline, this dimension, future, maybe crypto-terrestrial. That's another very good hypothesis. I just finished Jacques Vallée's most recent book a few weeks ago, and I quite liked it, actually. And one of the things that really struck me, coincidentally, at the same time, I've been reading and watching the old Jacques Cousteau specials with my daughter, who's really into Jacques Cousteau. And there's something really weirdly similar between a lot of these ships that landed or crashed in the desert in the 1940s and Jacques Cousteau's like diving saucer, which he actually based on flying saucers. Oddly enough, he designed it based on flying saucers in the 1950s. But there's something weirdly similar about these craft that were crashing or just landing and interacting with people in the 1940s and 50s. And it opens up strange possibilities. And also something about they're always ejecting material, which actually is a lot like submarines. It could be ballast, it's like, are these ships like Cousteau's diving saucer in reverse? Are these aquatic beings that are somehow sending these airships, these small kind of 2-3 man, airships that don't really have much in the way of propulsion or anything like that. And they kind of just wind up, landing or crashing or whatever. And then, having, shooting metal out as ballast the same way a submarine does. I don't know. There's something weirdly coincidental or archetypal or synchronistic. I don't know what it is. I don't know where I'm going with that observation, but yeah, there's so many possibilities. And I'm not committed to the time travel one, but since time is kind of my expertise, I'm sort of see it as my job to kind of push that idea as much as possible. But there are definitely other possibilities.
Seems like we could apply a machine learning algorithm to all of this, to at least like text modeling, like topic modeling in large text corpora, that you can identify sort of these consistent patterns.
Well, I'm sure that's like at the back of Jacques Vallée's mind when, he's been, creating these databases from the start. Sorry, I was interrupting someone who was talking, I think.
Oh, we had an unmuted new person on the call. Hi, Dr. Blue. Episode 124, folks. Dr. Blue's great. Actually, some of the stories that he tells in that episode are kind of relevant to this conversation, in as much as he was using LSD and hypnosis to explore people's UFO encounters and stuff. So anyway, I don't know if you want to chime in here. We're kind of getting to a point where we ought to wrap it up, I think. But one more time, if folks have any thoughts, Sherelle, please.
Hi. One thing that I always have difficulty in is just developing a mental model, especially for like the time paradox, whatever. I think it's really hard. So it was mentioned really early in the beginning. It was probably my first ideation of this was Slaughterhouse-Five. The main character imagines that we are all just this long, continuous, stretched out thing. At one end, you've got the baby, on the other end, and there's no interruption. And so when, Michael, you mentioned time worms, that was the first thing that I thought of. So there's an example of a model, but a lot of times like interdimensional or time travel, I find it very difficult to create those models. So Eric, it's your job to do that and to write about it and supposedly present something that can be tested. And I was wondering, and the other dummy part of me is like, is there any movie that I can think of that just seems to really explain time, that really just gets at that idea of time travel? And so that it made me think of it like, speaking of these ideas being informed from outside, do you have any book or movie that just really seemed to create a shortcut for you, like shorthand for like, yes, that is the model that I'm trying to like push or
well,
show?
definitely Arrival. More than anything else, gets it right as far as precognition and hints, of the long self and so on, the ideas that I'm talking about. So if you haven't seen Arrival, that's the number one. And it came out like right as I was writing Time Loops. I was just like, holy cow, this is it. And it's a super important movie, by the way, for precogs. Precogs I work with, they see this movie and go, yes, this movie gets it. And the movie helps them feel better about their experiences and their lifelong experiences of precognizing things and not recognizing it until after the fact and so on. So I definitely recommend that movie. And interestingly, it's very similar. It has a lot of, and I don't know if this is a function of Ted Chiang, who wrote the original story that was based on, or the filmmakers who adapted it, but there are similarities between it and Slaughterhouse-Five, because like the aliens themselves in Slaughterhouse-Five, they're described as these big toilet plungers, but that's not all that different from the aliens as they appear in Arrival. And there are points of similarity between these stories. So yeah, and Slaughterhouse-Five is another great example. And incidentally, Kurt Vonnegut himself was a precog. He had a very powerful precognitive experience, very powerful and life-altering precognitive experience that he had. I talk about that in Time Loops. So yeah, that would be the number one movie touchstone that I think I would recommend to people.
Well, interestingly, that it seems to be the most sensitive portrayal of alien contact that I've ever seen in a film. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's just a wonderful film. And I've watched it again and again and again. I just love it. And it's so many good things about it, including that it's about the military, but in this case, it's not, just this big space war scenario, and it's very sensitive, and it gets time and precognition right. It's so many good things about that movie. So yeah, I can't recommend it highly enough. And actually, another touchstone would be, it's based on a short story by Ted Chiang that's in his first collection of short stories called Stories of Your Life. Okay, the story that the movie's based on is called A Story of Your Life. But his second collection that came out just last year, called Exhalation, has a couple of other really, really, really good stories in it. And I actually have a whole chapter in my new book about Ted Chiang's dealing with the questions of time and time travel in his writings, because he gets it. And he has these short stories that are these beautiful, pure little thought experiments about time and free will and time travel and so on. And I mentioned earlier in our conversation, I mentioned his story, The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate. That's another one that I would highly recommend. And that's in his new collection called Exhalation. And, my thought experiment about the precognitive airbag, it's kind of inspired by another story also in the same collection by Chiang, called What's Expected of Us. And it's just like a 2-page short story about this little toy that anticipates. It's a little light that goes on a second before you press the button, and you can't defeat it no matter how hard you try. And it drives a certain number of players crazy. So his writings are really, really wonderful.
Dr. Blue, you're here.
And, I just want to make a comment on that research that I did. I was hired by Dr. Peter Phillips, who's a nuclear physicist who founded the McDonnell Douglas Institute for Psychic Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. And we rounded up about a dozen people who claimed they had been abducted by UFOs. And my job as a recent PhD in clinical hypnosis was to hypnotize them and take them back to their abduction vehicle so they could sketch out the instrument panel of the spaceship. So we did that, and my experience with these individuals was that about a quarter of them had stories which made a lot of sense. They had detailed remembrances of the instrument panels, and I don't know what Dr. Phillips did with them, if he ever communicated to NASA or other people who actually built spaceships. But about a quarter of them were pretty crazy and psychotic, and the other half were somewhere in between. They were anxious and wanted a lot of attention, and it seemed like they were getting it through these recollections of being abducted. But there was a good 25-30% of them that were stable people who had regular lives, who were not crazy, and had distinct memories of taking a free flight on a spaceship. So there you go.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and who knows what to do with all of it. Yeah.
Although the whole point of the trying to please your therapist comes up in your conversation of Jung, and that whole notion of like you might be like bullshitting yourself and your therapist in order to get the attention, and that's like a totally justifiable kind of circuit.
And you might not know you're doing it. I mean, that's, people don't consciously try to please their therapist, but unconsciously they're producing dreams that fulfill the expectations of their therapists. And more importantly,
that's why when you hypnotize people, for lawyers or the police try to remember the details of a crime, the first thing I tell them is, don't tell me anything about what happened, because I don't want to have any clues or cues to direct them in the direction that the sponsor wants me to find. But I did solve several murders for the FBI and Albuquerque police, keeping those things in mind. So memories are there sometimes that people can't remember. And with clinical medical hypnosis, they can remember things.
I would add that so are premeries. Hypnotic trance is a highly precognogenic state. And this is what people don't realize. In hypnotic trance, a lot of what people are producing, I think, a lot of the time is precognizing stimuli that they will encounter later. And this model really puts a monkey wrench in things like past life regression and the kind of abduction experience. How many of these people might be, in fact, in trance, producing a precognitive experience of something they're going to read in a book later, or something they're going to see in a movie later. And that it raises the possibility of the abduction phenomenon, like so many other religious phenomena or quasi-religious phenomena, being a kind of echo chamber of people being precognitive. Again, it's misrecognized precognition that's being misinterpreted or reinterpreted as something from the past. So, and it's all hypothetical, but I think it's a hypothesis that needs to be tested to sort of rule out certain possibilities.
Blue, I had to mute you. Sorry, you're getting feedback. You may remember
the one incident where a whole flight to Hawaii had the roof peel off and a passenger got sucked out of the plane and died. That was about 15 years ago. Well, I had a patient who was a nurse who was supposed to be on that flight, and she was supposed to be on the seat next to the one where the patient got sucked out. And she had a dream about that the night before the flight, canceled her flight.
That's amazing. Do you have a written account of this, or is this something?
No, but I could write it down for you if you want.
Oh my God, that'd be fantastic. I would love to hear this in detail. If you could email it.
The second part of the story is she was very depressed and didn't respond to traditional therapy, cognitive therapy, or hypnotherapy. And so I did a Groff breathing session with her, hyperventilation breathing, which changes the carbon dioxide level in your brain and get cellular memories. She started talking in German and describing places in Germany that were concentration camps. And she had no family who was in the Holocaust. She didn't speak German. And we looked up these places and they were real places. So.
Well, that's one of those things that, like, I think you make a really good point, Eric, about the tracer in these experiences. I think we talked about this when I had you on for episode 117, which is that, like, I was haunted for years by this sort of apparition of this like I took it to be like a Jungian anima, like a witch, like a Black Madonna type figure. And as soon as a friend recommended I start asking about this figure, it gave me personal details that I then went online and looked up and was like, oh my God, it's perfectly confirmed, this thing. But like, we keep making this mistake and assuming that we're validating some sort of external phenomenon when what in fact we're doing is gaining information that then is leaking backwards through time, which gets to the whole point about, and I know we talked about this, and this seems like a great place to sort of wrap this conversation, which is the fact that your work provides a testable hypothesis for debunking ESP. And as like, you just don't provide validation to the people involved in the study. There's like an orthogonal axis that you have to start blinding all of this stuff in order to really tease these things apart. So to the point of like getting back to the citizen science project that you're trying to like bootstrap here with this book, I'd love to pass the ball for you to touch down and talk a little bit about these sort of open science protocols, you know, like Jacques Vallée talks about the invisible college. I'm not sure if that's the book you were referencing just a moment ago, but I would love to hear and leave everybody on this call with a sense for how we all collectively, both here and everyone else reading and thinking about this stuff, may actually start formalizing this stuff into a large sort of citizen science initiative, because that's where things get really exciting for me.
Yeah. So I sort of, you're referring to the fact that I'm viewing this new book as an invitation to citizen science, which is the only way we're going to make progress on this. I'm trying to, I think you described it in one of your emails as an end run. And I like that. I'm trying to make an end run around the standard practice of people who write about this stuff, people who write about parapsychology, and trying to provide some proof that'll finally convince a skeptic, which is never going to happen. It's just never going to happen. And so much ink is wasted, as far as I'm concerned, writing, these little articles for like some little parapsychology journal. I'm a member of those societies, but I'm sorry, nobody reads those articles except for people who are already believers in this stuff. And I think that's a waste of time. I think the important thing to do is to get more and more people to experience this in their own lives, to make this a part of their daily practice. And really, it just means keeping a dream. A lot of people keep dream journals anyway, but keeping a dream journal with an eye to this. And so I provide some steps that you need to take. It's very simple. I mean, the precognitive dreamwork is the simplest thing in the world. You just have to go back to your dream records, record all your dreams, and then go back to those records over the next couple of days at night, at the end of the day, just kind of revisiting your dreams in light of things that happened in that interim. And when people start realizing, oh, wait, I'm having precognitive dreams, this is a real thing, that will kind of, I hope, change the conversation. So it's not citizen science in the sense that I'm trying to amass like a data set. I would have, if I were trying to do that, I would have set up a website. Well, here's where you submit your dream and all that. I don't have the capabilities of doing that. And I don't think that's been done. That's done by everybody else. But there are those sites out there by other authors, they'll have their book on precognition or ESP, and here's the website and here's our discussion forum, and you can, submit your thing. I'm not convinced that's going to be the lead to the tipping point. I think the tipping point is going to be more and more people, more and more smart, rational people on social media sharing their stories and no longer accepting the kind of lame pushback from skeptics over these topics. And we've seen how this can happen. We've seen it with UFOs, right? Over the last 5 years, we've seen a change in the discourse. Whatever you think of the information that's come out, whether or not you completely trust it or not, I don't. But at least there's been a change in the discourse, and it's no longer acceptable to simply ridicule the topic. And that's what I'm trying to get to with precognitive dreaming, because actual scientists, dream scientists, still just dismiss and ridicule the topic. And if we can get to a point where enough people are going, no, you can't, no, that's not fair. You cannot do that. You cannot just ridicule this topic that in fact everybody is experiencing, and eventually you'll have some young postdoc psychologist who's had precognitive dreams of her own and starts a research program and makes it legitimate. I think, for one thing, the actual paradigm shift has got to start in physics. It can't start in psychology, because it has to be acceptable in physics to talk about this. And then after physics, in biology to start talking about it, then it will be acceptable to psychologists, because psychologists are so afraid of seeming unscientific that they need that leadership from these other fields. So I think it's, but I think what we're seeing right now with quantum computing, and are going to see, I think, over the next decade, 2 decades with quantum computing, I think that's going to make this process inevitable of a kind of change in consciousness that, hey, it's no longer ridiculous at all to talk about retrocausal dimensions of our experience and things like precognitive dreams and so on. So,
well, I won't die happy until the Santa Fe Institute is studying the stochastic thermodynamics and entropy production of time loops. So,
well, I won't either.
Yeah, so here's to hoping that we can achieve critical cultural saturation.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, this has been awesome. I want to thank you for taking an extra long time to chat with us today, and for writing so many good books and essays and articles and podcast appearances and all this stuff to get this stuff out there, to get people thinking about it. I really appreciate it. And I want to let everybody unmute and give the guy a round of applause.
Hey.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the great questions and the conversation. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Eric.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Eric.
And if you're listening to this sometime in the future, I guess you... Awesome. Thanks, everybody. This will be up on the podcast feed in a couple weeks if you want to share it with your friends. And Eric, I'll reach out to you by email and see if there are any affordances for us to put our heads together about some of this specifically the evolution and creativity stuff. Seems like I'd love to rap with you about that.
Absolutely.
Cool. Take care, everybody.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks again for listening. Future Fossils is an independent, entirely listener-supported program. If you believe in the work that I'm doing and you want to help see it thrive into the unimaginable future, then avail yourself of all of the backstage goodies at patreon.com/Michael Garfield. Reach out to me personally at Michael Garfield on Twitter or Instagram, and have a wonderful eon.